Bonjour, good morning, or good afternoon. A very warm welcome to everybody here in Canada and abroad. I'm Sheikh Tijan Bangura, President of Africa Study Group of the Canadian International Council in Ottawa. We are delighted to welcome you to a new webinar on the theme towards COP28, Global and African Perspective on Climate Change. Vers la COP28, perspective mondiale et africaine sur le changement climatique. This session is held in partnership with the Institute for African Studies of the Carleton University. I would like first to acknowledge that the Africa Study Group is hosting this meeting, this international roundtable from Ottawa on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. Je tiens à souligner que nous tenons cette session à partir d'Ottawa, territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple Anishinaabe Algonquin. The Africa Study Group of the Canadian International Council addresses a variety of themes at our events through a series of discussions, including strengthening Canada-Africa relations, the role and importance of the African-Canadian diaspora in Canada, African Free Trade Area issues, aspect of global health issues, in particular COVID and post-COVID issues, security and stabilization in Africa as an essential condition for sustainable development, on constitutional changes of government, the impact of violent extremism and terrorism in Africa, and security and governance in the Sahel after the withdrawal of French forces from Mali. Today, we are talking about climate change, and this session is part of our series of discussion called Climate Change, a Global Issue. In this context, our previous discussions have explored such subjects as Africa and climate change, concrete progress. That was 2 years ago. Then we had climate change in Africa, COP27, and its challenges. And today our thematic is a kind of prelude to the conference of the Party on Climate Change, abbreviated as COP28. The webinar will be moderated by Professor Mike Beal. We are blessed to have him, a former Assistant Deputy Minister for Environmental Protection and at Environment and Climate Change, Canada. He retired from the public service in 2018 after a 37-year career in the environment and energy field. As Assistant Deputy Director for Environmental Development under the administration, he was responsible for the development and administration of regulation in the area of climate change, air pollution, water pollution, and chemical management. In addition, and I have to add this one, from 2013 to 2016, Mike was ADM, responsible for the Canadian Wildlife Service. Regulations developed during Mike's tenure as ADM, which began in 2009, include those of coal-fired electricity, renewable fuels, air pollution from equipment, vehicle emissions, methane emissions from oil and gas, mining effluents, as well as emergency protection orders under the under the Species at Risk Act. Mike began his career in public administration in 1981 with what was then Energy, Mines and Resources Canada, and joined Environment Canada in 1989. Trained as an economist, he spent the early part of his career working on the economic dimensions of environmental and energy policy before moving to the regulatory world in 2005. And I will say, I believe that was an extraordinary step. In October 2018, Mike joined the Carleton University School of Public Policy and Administration as an assistant professor. And as I say, we are blessed to have him today as our moderator. So without further delay, I would like to turn the floor over to Professor Mike. Mike, s'il vous plaît, vous avez votre panel.
Merci beaucoup, Sheikh, and thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. It is a great honor for me today to be the moderator for this session. We have a very distinguished group of speakers, 4 speakers, and I now have the honor of introducing them all together one by one. Our first speaker will be Dr. Rajesh Shafil, who is the director of the 4C Maroc Climate Change Competence Center, responsible for climate policy support in Morocco and Africa. An environmentalist by training, Dr. Shafil joined Morocco's Department of Environment at its inception in 1993. She held a number of senior positions, including head of the Surveillance and Research Division, Director of Surveillance and Risk Prevention, and Regional Inspector for Spatial Planning and Territorial Development. Dr. Shafil then embarked on an international career with the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie in 2009, first as Program Specialist for International Negotiations on the Environment and Sustainable Development at the Institut de la Francophonie pour le Développement Durable in Quebec City, Canada, then as Program Specialist for Sustainable Development and Global Issues within the representation of the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie to the European Union in Brussels. In 2015, Dr. Shafil was appointed Director of Observation, Studies and Planning at the Moroccan Ministry of the Environment, and in 2018, as General Director of the Centre de Compétences en Changement de l'Environnement du Maroc, 4C Maroc, in charge of supporting climate policies in Morocco and Africa. In December 2019, Ms. Shafil was appointed by His Majesty King Mohammed VI, King of Morocco, as a member of the Special Commission on Morocco's New Development Model. Ms. Shafil holds a PhD in Environment and a DEA in Environment from the University of Lille 2 and the European Institute of Ecology in Metz, France. So it will be a great honor for us to hear from Dr. Shafil. Our second speaker will be Anya Beretta, who is head of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, KAS, Regional Program Energy Security and Climate Change in Sub-Saharan Africa in Nairobi, Kenya. In this position, she is responsible for the realization of activities around the nexus of energy security and climate change in all sub-Saharan countries. Ms. Beretta emphasizes the need for long-term adaptation and mitigation strategies throughout all of KAS activities, and is increasingly working with political stakeholders to create an enabling environment for low-carbon development. Prior to this position, she worked as an evaluation and monitoring advisor at KAS Germany, and as an evaluation and learning manager at the Westminster Foundation for Democracy in the UK. She holds a master's degree in European Studies and International Relations, as well as a certificate in Advanced Studies in Development and Cooperation from ETH Zurich. Ms. Beretta has a strong interest in the impact and sustainability of development cooperation. She has been working in Africa and on African issues for more than 10 years. Our third speaker will be Emmanuel Zek. Emmanuel Zek is Executive Director of EMDA Energy, member of the Environment and Development TM Network. He is a board member of the Global Network for Disaster Reduction, where he serves as a regional representative at West and Central Africa. Mr. Zek is a member of the ASG of the UNFCCC WIMXCOM and the SOEs, standing for Slow Onset Events Expert Group. His areas of expertise include climate change adaptation, climate finance, loss and damage, sustainable land management, and energy planning. He has been engaged at the national, regional, and international levels in the intergovernmental processes of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, and the Sendai Framework. Mr. Zek is a lead fellow cohort TIS on environment and sustainable development, a former member of the board of directors of Climate Action Network International, and former chair of the UNCCD CSO International Panel. Our fourth speaker will be Catherine Backus, who is Director of Climate Finance and Science with the Intact Sector on Climate Adaptation at Waterloo University in Canada. As Director of Climate Finance and Science, Catherine assesses the impact of climate change on specific industry sectors and the broader capital markets. She is developing guidance to help investment professionals integrate climate change and extreme weather risk into forward-looking portfolio analysis to minimize associated risk. By extension, her research will influence companies to adapt to climate change in an effort to minimize risk and exposure. Catherine holds an honours BSc in biological science from the University of Toronto, specializing in environmental science, and is a candidate for the Master of Environment and Business program at the University of Waterloo. In her previous role, Catherine worked with an affiliate of Raymond James Financial, where she developed a strong understanding of financial principles and practices. While obtaining the Canadian Securities Core certification, Catherine initiated and developed a framework for integrating environmental, social, and corporate governance, or ESG, factors into investment portfolios. She also led business analysis and development of advisory and client platforms across Canada and the United States. Catherine also spent several years with the insurance industry in Canada. She speaks frequently to professional audiences and is a guest lecturer to graduate students at various universities. Catherine is a member of the Ontario Biodiversity Council and the Canadian Association of Farm Advisors, as well as being a certified scuba diver. So we have a very distinguished group of panelists here today. And c'est un grand plaisir pour moi de maintenant introduire notre première intervenante, Dr. Sheffield. Dr. Sheffield, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to share my okay. It's okay? Est-ce que vous voyez mon écran?
Yes, it's okay. We can see your presentation.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much. Bonjour tout le monde. Je vais essayer de vous rapprocher en quelques minutes des réalités de la vulnérabilité du continent africain face aux effets néfastes des changements climatiques. Et dans une seconde étape, je vais un petit peu vous expliquer comment est-ce que le Centre de compétences en changement climatique, le 4C Maroc, agit au niveau du Maroc et au niveau de l'Afrique pour appuyer les politiques de lutte contre les changements climatiques. Donc, comme on le sait, l'Afrique est de loin le continent le plus vulnérable vis-à-vis des effets néfastes des changements climatiques. On sait que, par exemple, à l'horizon 2030, plus de 132 millions de personnes vont tomber dans l'extrême pauvreté du fait notamment des impacts néfastes des changements climatiques et que aujourd'hui on ressent déjà les impacts puisque près de 3,6 billions de personnes vivent dans un contexte ou dans des régions qui sont hautement vulnérables et hautement exposées aux impacts néfastes des changements climatiques. Alors, on sait également qu'à l'horizon 2050, près de 1 billion des habitants des zones côtières seront exposés notamment aux déplacements forcés du fait, bien sûr, de la remontée du niveau marin. Aujourd'hui, on sait que même la biodiversité souffre, bien entendu, très fortement des impacts néfastes des changements climatiques, puisque à plus 4 degrés Celsius, par exemple, si le changement climatique continue comme il est, comme la tendance d'aujourd'hui, donc on va perdre jusqu'à 39% des espèces connues sur Terre. Alors, l'agriculture, on sait que les populations africaines dépendent énormément de l'agriculture et malheureusement, près de 8% des terres arables connues aujourd'hui ne risquent plus de l'être à l'horizon 2100 puisque nous perdons, on le sait aujourd'hui, plusieurs milliers d'hectares dans toutes les régions du monde du fait de la désertification et de la sécheresse et que l'impact sur les infrastructures pourrait atteindre jusqu'à 10 trillions de dollars américains justement du fait de l'exposition aux catastrophes climatiques, notamment aux inondations. Alors, également, on sait à l'horizon 2030, on attend ou on risque d'avoir des impacts sur l'économie qui peuvent aller jusqu'à de 200 à 580 milliards de dollars et qu'à l'horizon 2080, malheureusement, le coût annuel des changements climatiques peut atteindre jusqu'à 6% du produit intérieur brut en Afrique. Alors, on a entendu beaucoup parler ces dernières années des loss and damage ou des pertes et dommages. On sait que c'était une demande qui date depuis plusieurs années, depuis qu'on a commencé à discuter au niveau international de la problématique des changements climatiques et qu'on a commencé à négocier sur les accords relatifs au changement climatique. Alors, on a tous entendu parler également qu'à la COP27, il y avait une avancée considérable puisque le point relatif aux pertes et dommages liés au changement climatique donc a été traité avec beaucoup de sérieux, si je peux dire, et avec beaucoup d'intérêt par les différentes délégations et qu'aujourd'hui, on est en train de préparer peut-être, si tout va bien, une décision sur les pertes et dommages à la COP28. Alors, on sait maintenant qu'il y a création d'une source de financement ou d'un mécanisme financier pour financer les pertes et dommages. Et donc, ce fonds pourrait être financé par des méthodes innovantes, etc. Il y a eu également la création d'un comité de transition pour justement s'intéresser à cette question des pertes et dommages et jeter les premiers jalons pour justement concrétiser des décisions claires sur cette notion de perte et dommages. Alors, pour ceux qui ne sont pas familiers avec la question des pertes et dommages, en fait, les pertes et dommages, c'est tout ce que nous perdons tous ensemble du fait des impacts néfastes des changements climatiques, notamment des catastrophes climatiques, des inondations, de la sécheresse, etc., etc. Et donc, bien entendu, les pertes et dommages peuvent être évaluables sur le plan économique, c'est-à-dire quand on a une perte de revenus agricoles ou bien des infrastructures qui sont démolies par les inondations, on peut estimer sur le plan économique le prix, si je peux dire, de ces pertes et dommages, mais malheureusement, il y a des pertes et des dommages qui ne sont pas évaluables de manière monétaire ou sur le plan monétaire, à savoir les vies humaines. Une seule vie humaine n'a pas de prix et donc on ne peut pas évaluer toutes les pertes et tous les dommages dus au changement climatique puisqu'il y a des pertes et des dommages et des destructions qui sont inestimables et qui ne peuvent pas être monnayées. Alors maintenant, en 2022, donc si on se remémore ensemble un petit peu les catastrophes qui sont passées l'année dernière, donc en fait, il y a quelques années, qu'est-ce qu'on disait au niveau international? On disait que les pays pauvres et les pays en développement, c'est eux qui vont le plus souffrir des impacts néfastes des changements climatiques. On a entendu parler de ça pendant au moins 20 ans, 25 ans, mais aujourd'hui, et hélas, force est de constater que même les pays les plus développés de la planète souffrent également des impacts des changements climatiques qui causent des destructions incroyables. On cite par exemple quelques exemples, la tempête Yann qui a touché Cuba et les États-Unis en 2022 et qui a coûté plus de 100 milliards de dollars. La sécheresse en Europe qui a approché les 20 milliards de dollars de pertes et également donc les inondations au Nigeria, les inondations en Afrique du Sud et puis la tempête Fiona qui a touché les Caraïbes et le Canada et dont les pertes causées ont été estimées à plus de 3 milliards de dollars. Donc, on voit très bien qu'aujourd'hui, qu'on soit pays du Nord ou pays du Sud, on est logé à la même enseigne et donc ce n'est pas seulement parce que les pays en développement ont des infrastructures de base qui sont parfois un petit peu faibles ou affaiblies, etc., qu'ils vont le plus souffrir des changements climatiques, mais tout le monde souffre aujourd'hui des impacts néfastes des changements climatiques. Alors, au Centre 4C Maroc, qu'est-ce que nous essayons de faire? En fait, nous essayons de répondre aux besoins des pays africains, de tous les pays africains, en termes de renforcement des compétences pour qu'ils puissent se doter de politiques efficaces de lutte contre les changements climatiques. On sait par exemple que le renforcement des compétences est une question très importante qui a été traitée dans les accords multilatéraux relatifs au changement climatique. C'est ainsi, par exemple, que la Convention cadre des Nations Unies sur les changements climatiques a traité de la question du renforcement des compétences dans l'article 6. Le protocole de Kyoto en a traité dans son article 10 et l'accord de Paris également a parlé de l'importance et de la grande importance du renforcement des capacités pour justement qu'on puisse avoir des politiques efficaces en termes de lutte contre les changements climatiques. Alors maintenant, si on va en évaluant les besoins des pays africains en termes de renforcement des compétences, bien sûr, ces besoins couvrent tous les aspects qui permettent de construire des politiques plus résilientes face aux effets néfastes des changements climatiques. Et donc, il y a bien sûr en Afrique beaucoup de besoins en termes de métriques et d'évaluation de la vulnérabilité des pays, de la vulnérabilité des secteurs de l'eau, de l'agriculture, de la pêche, des zones côtières, etc., face au changement climatique et surtout pour savoir peser et construire des politiques d'adaptation capables d'aider les pays africains à mieux s'adapter aux effets néfastes des changements climatiques. Alors, quand on fait des évaluations, beaucoup de pays africains parlent de leurs besoins en renforcement des compétences pour mener à bien ces évaluations, des besoins en termes de développement de la recherche scientifique pour trouver des solutions durables qui concernent chaque pays selon son contexte particulier. Donc, ils ont également des difficultés à maintenir des bases de données précises et suivies dans le temps et actualisées concernant tous les aspects liés au changement climatique, mais également il y a des besoins, bien sûr, en gestion des données et donc, comme j'ai dit tout à l'heure, en évaluation de la vulnérabilité et surtout en cartographie des risques climatiques, parce qu'aujourd'hui, pour pouvoir mener des politiques de développement, il faut savoir les mener en connaissance de cause et donc dealer avec la problématique des changements climatiques. Alors, l'autre aspect également, donc, qui est celui des inventaires des gaz à effet de serre, parce qu'on sait que l'accord de Paris est venu avec des nouveaux engagements pour les pays africains. Et donc, pour respecter leurs engagements, les pays ont tous établi leur indice, donc leur contribution déterminée au niveau national. Et dans ce cadre-là, ils doivent actualiser leurs inventaires des gaz à effet de serre et mener des politiques d'atténuation des émissions, de décarbonation de l'industrie, de l'économie, etc. Et là-dessus, également, il y a des besoins énormes en termes de connaissances et donc il y a des besoins également en termes de renforcement des compétences de tous les acteurs. Parce qu'il n'y a pas que l'administration, par exemple, de l'environnement ou du changement climatique ou de l'énergie qui est concernée par la problématique des changements climatiques, mais c'est vraiment tout le monde. Donc, c'est d'abord les collectivités territoriales, les élus, le secteur de la recherche, le secteur de la formation universitaire, le secteur de la formation professionnelle, le secteur de l'expertise, etc. Alors, qu'est-ce que le Centre 4C Maroc? Nous, on est en fait une plateforme de convergence des politiques de lutte contre les changements climatiques qui rassemble les 4 types d'acteurs au Maroc, donc le secteur public et les territoires, le secteur privé, le secteur de la recherche et de l'expertise et bien sûr la société civile. Alors, ces membres, qui sont au nombre de 40 sur cette plateforme, représentent en fait ou sont organisés au sein de 4 plateformes, donc qui représentent chaque type d'acteur. Alors, c'est quoi nos missions? Donc, nos missions, en général, donc pour résumer, c'est le soutien aux politiques climat dans le sens de plus large, aussi bien au Maroc qu'en Afrique, à travers notamment le renforcement des compétences de tous les acteurs concernés, le développement de produits pour l'aide à la prise de décision pour tous les décideurs, la capitalisation de l'information et des connaissances pour les mettre à la disposition des décideurs et du grand public, la facilitation du réseautage au niveau de l'Afrique et même dans la région MENA, et donc la participation ou la contribution à la mise en place de bases de données actualisées sur le changement climatique. Alors, ce que nous faisons, c'est que d'abord, pour faciliter l'accès à la finance climat pour les indices, aussi bien au Maroc qu'en Afrique, nous venons en appui technique pour justement aider à élaborer des fiches projets à partir des indices, donc des contributions déterminées au niveau national des différents pays. C'est ainsi que nous sommes aujourd'hui à une trentaine de projets élaborés à partir de l'indice du Maroc, mais également à partir des indices et du pipeline de projets du Fonds bleu du bassin du Congo au profit des 17 pays membres de la Commission climat du bassin du Congo. Alors, pour les territoires, nous agissons de plusieurs façons parce que la politique climatique, on le sait, doit être décentralisée au niveau des territoires pour répondre à leurs besoins particuliers, chacun donc selon ses priorités d'action, mais également selon ses capacités. Et donc, nous venons d'abord à aider à comprendre comment est-ce qu'on peut intégrer le changement climatique dans la planification territoriale, notamment dans les plans de développement pour les régions, pour les communes, etc. Nous venons également en appui à ces collectivités territoriales à travers le conseil et le soutien, justement, pour les aider à intégrer les impératifs de lutte contre les changements climatiques dans leur plan de développement. On vient également faciliter ou leur faciliter l'accès à la finance climat à travers justement des formations ciblées sur la finance climat, sur les exigences des bailleurs, comment est-ce qu'on peut monter un projet bancable, etc. Et surtout par la modélisation des risques climatiques à travers justement le développement d'une cartographie des risques climatiques. Et nous avons commencé par une expérience pilote que nous avons terminée dans le nord du Maroc et que nous sommes en train de chercher à développer aussi bien sur le reste du territoire national que transmettre et partager l'expérience avec d'autres pays africains. Alors, toujours pour les collectivités territoriales, nous avons élaboré également des guides, donc des guides pour montrer aux collectivités territoriales comment est-ce que nous pouvons intégrer ce changement climatique dans la planification et le travail de tous les jours. Donc, les deux guides que vous voyez, donc l'un sur la planification territoriale et les changements climatiques, et l'autre est un guide d'accès à la finance climatique pour les collectivités territoriales. Alors, nous agissons également, comme j'ai dit, donc par l'aide à la prise de décision à travers notamment l'élaboration de policy briefs pour justement rapprocher les décideurs de la réalité des impacts des changements climatiques et leur donner des moyens pour l'aide à la prise de décision. Je cite juste deux exemples de ces policy briefs. Donc, on en a fait une, par exemple, sur le mécanisme d'ajustement carbone aux frontières parce que le Maroc est très concerné par le Green Deal européen et les normes carbone que l'Union européenne impose à ses importations, et le Maroc est l'un des pays les plus concernés par les exportations vers l'Union européenne, et nos industriels doivent être au fait justement de ce mécanisme d'ajustement carbone aux frontières de l'Union européenne. Et nous avons élaboré un autre policy brief sur le nouveau modèle de développement du Maroc et son contenu concernant le changement climatique. Nous en avons également élaboré sur genre et climat, et nous sommes en train de finaliser des policy briefs sur les pertes et dommages en Afrique, sur la décarbonation de l'économie africaine et sur d'autres sujets. Alors maintenant, l'un des secteurs également donc sur lesquels nous travaillons, c'est les ONG, donc la société civile, et nous les aidons justement à construire des plaidoyers. Vous voyez ici à droite, par exemple, les documents de plaidoyer que nous avons aidé les ONG. Donc, on les a aidés à construire ces plaidoyers pour justement œuvrer auprès des partis politiques et des décideurs sur l'introduction de la notion de changement climatique et des impératifs de lutte contre les changements climatiques dans les politiques territoriales et les politiques sectorielles nationales et régionales. Et nous formons également les ONG sur les différents sujets liés au changement climatique. Alors, l'une de nos actions phares, c'est tout le travail que nous menons avec le secteur de la recherche et avec les universités marocaines, puisque nous avons œuvré pour inscrire dans les cursus marocains 3 masters universitaires spécialisés en changement climatique durant l'année 2022-2023. Nous sommes très fiers d'avoir été derrière l'inscription de ces masters nationaux spécialisés en changement climatique, parce que c'est bien la première fois au Maroc que nous avons donc un tel diplôme ou de tels diplômes, parce qu'ils sont au nombre de 3, qui permettent de former une nouvelle pépinière de jeunes décideurs qui connaissent très bien la problématique des changements climatiques et qui vont travailler dans les différents domaines pour justement disséminer le savoir et en tenir compte dans leur travail quotidien. Alors, l'une de nos actions phares, c'est ce qu'on a appelé la African Climate Academy ou la masterclass africaine du Centre 4C Maroc. Et dans cette masterclass qui est complètement gratuite et à distance, nous œuvrons justement pour former les jeunes leaders africains et africaines de moins de 35 ans. Nous avons 54% de filles et donc nous délivrons une formation de très haut niveau de 6 mois de tronc commun plus 3 mois de spécialisation, soit en vulnérabilité adaptation, soit en atténuation et inventaire des gaz à effet de serre. Et c'est comme ça que nous sommes arrivés à former jusqu'à aujourd'hui 1200 jeunes filles et garçons africains de plus de 35 pays africains avec une formation de très haut niveau en changement climatique. Alors, la African Climate Academy démarre bientôt, donc début 2024. Elle sera dans une forme un petit peu nouvelle, avec justement un voyage d'études pour partager l'expérience du Maroc pour les étudiants les plus méritants qui auront obtenu leur diplôme dans le cadre de la African Climate Academy. Alors, bien sûr, avec les pays africains amis, donc nous travaillons beaucoup avec les 3 commissions climat en Afrique créées à l'initiative de Sa Majesté le roi Mohamed VI, roi du Maroc, à la COP 22, donc à savoir la commission climat du bassin du Congo, la commission climat du Sahel et la commission climat des États insulaires d'Afrique. Et ces 3 commissions réunies totalisent environ 45 pays africains. Nous agissons de plusieurs manières avec eux, d'une part à travers des ateliers et des formations de très haut niveau pour les hauts cadres et pour les décideurs de tous ces pays sur la finance climat, sur la territorialisation de l'action climatique, sur les pertes et dommages, etc. Et nous avons également aidé à créer 2 mécanismes financiers spécialisés en Afrique, à savoir le Fonds bleu du bassin du Congo et le mécanisme financier du Sahel, qui sont 2 fonds spécialisés dont et l'appui technique et financier a été offert par le Centre 4C Maroc, donc pour la mise en place de ces fonds qui sont maintenant une réalité en Afrique. Donc voilà un petit peu, j'espère que j'ai pu vous donner quelques idées sur justement comment nous agissons au sein du Centre 4C Maroc. Je m'excuse, je ne sais pas si j'ai été un petit peu lente, mais donc j'ai essayé de parler doucement pour les gens peut-être qui n'arrivent pas à suivre en français. Et donc je vous remercie pour votre aimable attention.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Shafil. C'était très informant et très intéressant comme présentation. On vous remercie beaucoup. Our second speaker is Dr. Anya Beretta, and she will speak to us on EU-Africa climate diplomacy, a pragmatic approach for COP28. So, Anya, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thanks for giving me the word. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the African Study Group and the Canadian International Council for inviting me. Let me just share my screen. I hope you can see it. Yeah.
Yes, we can see you.
Excellent. So yes, I just want to probably, Dr. Shafi, also congratulate Morocco. I know they have been one of the countries that is absolutely leading in Africa on efforts to tackle climate change. Yeah, congratulations on taking on that leadership. So I'm going to probably zoom out a bit. I'm going to talk more generally on EU-African climate diplomacy. Before doing so, just allow me to say a word on Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, or Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which is a German organization that not all of you might be familiar with. So yeah, we are basically a bit of a specific body of the German Development Corporation. We are non-technical. The Konrad Adenauer Foundation has offices in more than 100 countries worldwide. More than 20 in sub-Sahara Africa. We have different missions, and every office deals with another topic. Most of them are country offices. My office is a bit particular. It's a regional office that deals only with energy security and climate change. Let's say the main objective, overall objective, is to create an enabling environment for more conducive climate change adaptation and mitigation policies in the region. We do work a lot with regional organizations, of course, the UNEP Africa office, but also the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, as well as the regional organizations, ECOWAS, ICRI in Cape Verde, for Southern Africa, SASCAL. So basically all the regional institutions that deal with climate change and adaptation questions. We also offer a bit similar to the speaker in Morocco, formations and studies, and to younger entrepreneurs. We do work a lot on the aspect of climate smart agriculture. We have a climate diplomacy academy, but we also work substantially with African parliamentarians from different countries, because we believe that the parliament, as a democratic institution, is the body that needs to implement the Paris agreements and really transform it into national laws in order to realize NDCs. And we see that, you know, parliaments in African countries might not always be in the position to do so. But we do, of course, want to strengthen the competencies of parliament. So this is a very important topic for us. Today, I'm going to talk very briefly on the EU-Africa climate diplomacy, and I'm very happy to answer any questions after, if there might be. So I would just like to invite you to zoom out. Dr. Shafil has given an excellent overview on the issues that Africa is currently facing, climate change, loss and damage, and the enormous threat that climate change presents to African countries. Now, as well as climate change is a topic that is now cross-cutting. It has impacts on infrastructure, economy, and trade, of course. I think it's also really important to understand that when we talk about climate negotiations, such as the COP28, are also happening within the broader geopolitical context. And if we are zooming out a bit on the bigger picture, I just want to say that in this moment in time, unfortunately, we are facing a situation in which the world politics are becoming more and more unpredictable and also more unstable. We have a growing competition between the US and China. We had the pandemic COVID-19 with the devastating economic effects around the world globally, devastating economic consequences, particularly in Africa, that countries are still recovering from. We have a new war in Europe with the Russia aggression against Ukraine. And sadly, since more or less a month ago, a new war the terrorists that have been caused by the terrorist attacks of Hamas, and of course the Israeli reaction to it. So everything seems very unstable and insecure. On the European level, the economic, let's say, growth is significantly slowing down. We have weakening of democracies. We're seeing more and more political forces that are clearly anti-democratic on the rise also in Europe. We have a global competition for raw materials and so on. And on the African level, we have a growing insecurity in the Sahel region, in the Horn of Africa and North Africa. And we have also seen quite a number of coups over the past years, unfortunately. So this is, let's say, a bit the setting that obviously does play a role in international negotiations, and also will, I think, play out in the COP28 and in how far. At the same point in time, we see that in this end of, let's say, the US dominance, we see that African agency is actually increasing. There's a growing assertiveness. African countries do want to play a level on the international level, and I would say particularly on the matter of climate change. We have seen the lead of the Kenyan President Ruto in the recent African Climate Summit in Nairobi. It has often been dubbed as the Kenya Climate Summit. I mean, it was originally a summit of the African Union, the first of its kind on the African continent. But I think the Nairobi Declaration, as a result of it, came out very strongly and underlined the willingness of African countries to really play a very dominant role in the matter of climate change. And I think this has been really perceived positively in the rest of the world. I'm based here in Nairobi, and I got a lot of requests during and after the climate summit from European media who in the first place didn't have this on the radar as an important meeting, but just understood the magnitude of it while it was happening. And I think it sent a very positive and a very clear sign worldwide that Africa is definitely ready to take responsibility and leadership to tackle this global problem. I think in this context, we can't really compare, of course, the African Union and the European Union, also because the mandate is to a certain extent limited. And so the African Union probably as an actor remains less powerful than the European Union. I think in the climate space, particularly what we have seen over the last years, is that Africa has managed at more or less every COP to come out with a common African position. There's a very clear mechanism on the African continent how these positions are formed. There is a very strong African group of negotiators that has been very successful in lobbying the African causes at the climate change summits, and also representing Africa with the united voice. In September 2023, the African Union has also gained a permanent membership to the G20, which is now the G21. This is also a sign that, the rest of the world is, I think, ready to integrate Africa more into international fora, as it probably has done before. So, and while we speak, it's not only on climate change that Africa is taking really a lead position. While we speak, the global treaty to end plastic pollution is taking place in Kenya. And again, there's an African group of negotiators that has really managed to get a very, combined standpoints from all African countries, and is able to speak with one voice. So I would say, within this background, which is not so positive, Africa has, understood that there might be a window of opportunity, which is also due to this increased competition, the need for European countries to de-risk, which basically means to diversify value chains. And Africa is definitely more on the agenda than it has been 5 years ago or so, to become one of the partners of Europe. I would say this is especially true for critical minerals and metals that are needed for the energy transition. Europe has seen the importance, again, to diversify, and that means essentially to move away supply chains from China, and is seeking actively how this can be done with African partners. And I think, you know, as this is a priority, this obviously gives Africa some leverage to be heard and to put African priorities on the table in a more prominent way than it used to be. And for instance, this would be, you know, having a clearer focus on adaptation rather than mitigation, Africa being obviously the continent that is less responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. So this is really an opportunity. At the same time, I think we really have to see that we are becoming, this is also why I said we're having a more pragmatic approach now. I think Europe has understood that some parts of the discussion between Europe and African countries over the past years has not been really pragmatic, but has been, you know, more driven by what Europe thought were the priorities for Africa, without necessarily consulting with African countries. You know, the problem or the challenge that European countries had over the past 2 years to replace gas from Russia for energy security has really shown that, or demonstrated that, you know, the energy transition is actually something that needs a lot of time, and that might not be feasible from one day to the next. And, you know, in this whole scenario, asking a continent to shift energy systems into renewable energies where energy is barely available has, you know, sometimes been a discourse that has been highly, you know, imbalanced. And I think European countries are definitely more ready now to really listen into African priorities and recognize that the access to energy is really a priority for African countries. I'm not saying at any cost, but, you know, you can't ask people to sit in the dark and breathe fresh air. And I think that has come also to the understanding of European countries. And obviously, you know, that plays into the whole logic that Africa is, that climate change is a global problem for which African countries are really by no means responsible. And just, you know, to come back on this aspect of critical minerals for the energy transition, I think this is really, you know, a double win, and African countries can really get a lot out of this situation, because, as I said, European countries need to diversify because this is a geopolitical imperative. On the other hand, we do need these green minerals for energy transition goals that you know, industrialized countries have given themselves. So this really gives African countries a leverage to demand better conditions, you know, for example, on the issue of local content, local value chain, and so on. Now, if I can zoom in, what does it mean for EU-Africa climate cooperation at COP28? I think the biggest achievement of climate diplomacy over the past 12 months has really been shared vision of Africa and European Union to go, that we are in need of a new climate financial order. There have been a couple of summits over the year. It has also been addressed at the African Climate Summit in Nairobi. But as the French President Emmanuel Macron said, I think it was in June, you know, at the financial summit in France, no country should have have to choose between tackling poverty and dealing with climate change. And I think it's really the moment in which Europe, for sure, I don't know if all industrialized countries, but European countries for sure have understood that we can't we can't continue with the financial orders and the financial institutions that we have as of today. Climate finance will remain a crucial topic at COP28. I'm 100% sure that we will also read again of the $100 billion that the industrialized countries have promised, let's say the global south yearly to address climate change. And actually we have met this promise 2022, I think, for the first time. However, I firmly believe that we have to move away from who is I don't want to say blame or shame game, but saying a simple finance transfer will fix the problem, because it will not. There will never be enough money, public finance to tackle climate change and to adapt and to mitigate in let's say the global south or African countries. And so we really need an institutional reform. I'm also very skeptical on bold financial commitments happening at COP28. I do agree that they are necessary, but again, going back to the context, excuse me, I think it's also important to understand that European countries are in really not a good economic situation. And for example, Germany alone has spent 6.3 billion euros in 2022 on foreign aid that is climate change related. That is 1/4 or 25% of the entire budget for education in Germany, which is a lot of money, and it's not nothing. And it becomes increasingly difficult in these times to make people understand why so much money is spent on climate change, and yet the demands and the numbers on the table are basically becoming higher and higher every year. And I'm sure that within the global stocktake, we will also speak, or we hear a lot of new numbers in terms of financial support. But who is going to match these numbers? And I therefore think that we really need an institutional reform. And I also think that European countries are very ready to support that. Having said that, I am, of course, of a very firm belief that European Union has to deliver concrete actions, plans for technology transfer and capacity building on the continent to honor the common but differentiated responsibility. But we really have to think and ask ourselves, what does this concretely mean, common but differentiated responsibilities? Is it one end is receiving and the other end is giving? And again, I don't think that this is a model that has much future. This means, of course, for European countries that we have to ask ourselves a lot of uncomfortable questions. What is the price to preserve natural resources, such as the rainforest in the DRC? What are we willing to pay if African countries commit to climate protection or to commit to leave their fossil fuels in the ground? I'm not 100% sure that the loss and damage fund that has been also mentioned by my previous speaker is a success story for African countries, quite frankly. I think it might end up being a Pyrrhic victory, because what we're seeing now is that there's so many open questions. Who is eligible? How is it going to be determined? What country gets how much? And there's just a lot of little questions. And I'm just afraid that before the first money will actually flow, a lot of time will pass by. So I would hope that I'm wrong, but I'm not 100% sure that the loss and damage question will progress substantially at COP28. That brings me to the last point of my intervention. The African Agency, this idea to really play a more dominant role when it comes to climate change on the continent or on the global scale, is to some extent still not compatible with this old paradigm that we still have in African-European relationships, which is the giver-receiver, conditionality, carrot and the stick. There are a lot of names for it. And we really need to overcome this paradigm. this paradigm. I think one solution that has also been given by President Ruto in the Nairobi Declaration is really to shift from aid to trade. So seeing climate change as an economic opportunity, introducing more innovative climate finance instruments such as climate for debt swaps, carbon credits. Kenya is working on a law, or actually has passed a law to facilitate carbon credits. And from the other side, from the European side, the real partnership cannot longer be a lip service. There have been different projects to revitalize the partnership, but again, we need to be very firm and very committed and really implement actions and stop talking about seeing Africa as a real partner. It needs to happen, and it needs, probably it's hurtful sometimes to take African priorities more into consideration as they have been taken into consideration previously. The previous speaker mentioned those concepts like CBAM, the Green Deal. Very often, I think these concepts are done with great intentions, but have we really asked the African counterparts, what do you think? What do you need? Can we help you to implement, CBAM? Will it hurt your economy? How can we avoid that? And that has not always been, the case, unfortunately, in the past. For Africa, I think we have to move away in the climate change negotiations or in the diplomacy to some extent away from expectations of financial support. And, it would be great to see more proactive solutions from African countries, a very candid and open discussion on priorities, but also addressing challenges on the African continent. We always, we hear that the cost of capital for example, for renewable energies is very high in Africa. This is, of course, also to do with the risk perception, and not only the perceived risk, but also the real risk. So there are some issues like, insecurity, weak governance, that we need to address in a partnership principle. And if Africa really overcomes this paradigm of being on the lower end of receiving, but really presents itself as the continent of opportunities that is backed up with strong political will, I think green trade and industries can really make the difference, and can lead the way to a very successful COP28, and probably really a reviewed and revitalized EU-African partnership. Thank you very much for your attention, and happy to answer any questions after.
Thank you so much, Anya, for that very provocative and stimulating presentation. Greatly appreciated. Let's move now to our third presentation from Emmanuel Zek. And Mr. Zek's presentation is on les changements climatiques et la transition juste en Afrique. The climate change and the right transition or just transition in Africa. So over to you, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Just to add, when you were doing my presentation, that I had the honor to serve in the board of directors with the actual Minister of Environment, Mr. Stephen Gibbo, during 5 years in the Climate Action Network International. So this said, I think that Raja and Anya, they have already said the same. But as we, the organization I'm representing, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of our institution, ENDA, which means Environment and Development Action in the Third World. I would like just to remind that ENDA, as the environmental and development organization, has been working on the issue of climate change for more than 3 decades. We started working on these issues in 1990, just before that the Climate Change Convention being adopted in 1992 in Rio. So in this, and to say that it is one of the biggest southern NGOs which grow to the other parts of the world, particularly in Latin America, where we have an office in Dominican Republic. We have one also in Bolivia. We have an office in Asia, in Vietnam. And the main office that we had in Africa, Madagascar, Ethiopia, Mali, Niger, and the headquarters is based in Dakar. So we were a think tank working on environment issue and development. So during these years on environmental issues, we worked on research, training. These have been important focus in our activities, particularly with the analysis of vulnerability of population and the inventories of the greenhouse gases in the different countries. We have contributed also in the development of NAPAS. NAPAS is the National Adaptation Plan that was elaborated by the least developing countries, and then after we come with the NAPS and also the national determined contribution. So this work stream relating to climate change are underpinned by the projects that we developed targeting citizenship. When I'm talking about citizenship, is just to highlight the fact that the Paris Agreement gives opportunities not only to parties because it is country-driven, but to all actors to at least contribute to achieve the objectives. Because our belief is that if we don't have a critical mass of citizens who understand the challenge of climate change and be involved in the process, it will be difficult for us to shift a paradigm. I mean, to come to a low carbon and resilient society. So we need everyone on board within this process, not only those who are negotiating or those who know the issue on the environmental, but bring these issues at the citizenship level. So after that, so we are targeting also the ecosystem, the population, the civil society actors, the local authorities. We have heard about the localization and also the state. Talking about the local level, what we are looking is mainly to promote the local entrepreneurship, because we believe that to strengthen the resilience of communities, we should at least build on some value chain, like the milk value chain, non-timber forest product, improve cook stove, access to energy, etc. So we all know that the civil society actors are playing a key role, not only at the country level, but also at the international level in advocating for the key issue to be considered in the climate change process. We have talked about the loss and damage. If needs, I will come back on that. But many issues were highlighted at the international level because of civil society actors, even though it is the party who are taking decision. But I think the civil society organization are key players and key protagonists in this process. And the localities also. What we do with the localities, we know that climate change do not know any borders. When we are talking about coastal erosion, if you tackle the issues, for example, by building seawall in a localities, it may create maladaptation. So we bring sometimes localities together to deal with different issues like coastal erosion, forest management, sustainable land management. And also we have contribute in supporting government. We work with Maroc Katrisi, with Raja, in supporting countries, for example, in the annual report and the national communication on climate change. So this is just to back on the issues. I would like to just remind that climate change is more than an environmental issue. It's become a prominent topic at the international debate. So for me, it is not even only a political issue. It is a geopolitical issue. And when we are talking about geopolitical issues, it means that in terms of development, we come to what we say a limit to growth. And when you find a limit to growth, you reach the cap, so you have to find alternatives, and it is where we are. Can we continue using the energy, which is not sustainable, I mean fossil fuel, for years? No, we have to find other alternatives like solar, like renewable energy, and it is where we are. How could we do it? Africa is concerned. When we say that Africa is concerned, we have raised, and Raja did it, some impact that we are being affected. I will add on this an increase in droughts. If you look at the Sahel region, so it is the more prone to conflict. All the line from Dakar, I mean the Senegal, to Djibouti, and even if you cross the border going to the eastern country, Afghanistan, all these countries, they are prone also to conflict. Conflict sometimes due to the over access of resources, but also we will have to highlight the fact that there is an increase of an explosion of climate refugees, and even an increase in terms of health issues. So this said, we know that the IPCC highlight many issues, and what is said is that without a proactive policy to drastically reduce the release of greenhouse gases, the Earth temperature could be rise by more than 4%. And when this comes, it means that it will not be 4 degrees, everywhere. It will be differentiated. For example, if you say 3 degrees in the Sahara and the Sahel, you have to add 1 more. That means 4 degrees. This will not be sustainable at all for our communities. So, do we have many solutions related to the climate change issues? I will say no. We don't have many solutions. The main solution that we have is that all countries, but particularly the industrialized, developed countries, to really take significant quantified commitment in order to not exceed the 2 degrees, as we agreed in Paris. But if you look at the situation, we have the global stocktake that were done based on the national determined contribution that were shared by the countries. We are not at all feeling the commitment that we have to do to at least save the world or preserve the world for the future generation. For me, this implies that the total accumulation of the CO2 be not exceeding the 209 gigatons. So there is really a lot to do in terms of reducing, not only by 60% for those who can do, but 70% in 2050, based on the reference that we have in 2010. And before reaching the 2100, that we come to a net zero emission in terms of carbon. But for Africa, we will say, yes, we can use the easiest way. Why will not do like the other did? I mean, the development first, which remains for us to get emerging or developed. I will not say that it is the best that we can use it by really industrializing and using fossil fuel. It is a process that many countries have used and I'm not sure that it is the most sustainable for us in Africa. Why? Anya said it. Africa have an advantage in fighting against climate change. In many countries in the region, the basic infrastructure are not in place. So if we have the technology, I think the best way will be to be in the sustainable pathway. Why? Because despite the energy poverty that is characterized by a low access to electricity and a lot of use, I mean more than 70% of the population using the traditional biomass for cooking. The resources are abundant in our region. During the climate summit in Nairobi, the head of state were calling for a lot of investment in Africa, even though we have some weaknesses in terms of environmental policies or something like related to that. The potential are there. We have a potentialities in terms of wind, which is concentrated in many coastal areas. We have a potential in small hydro. Africa is one of the continent or the region who have a lot of potential on solar in the world. So all this can be used if there is a good access in the technology. So I think in terms of transition, whatever may happen, we should place the development at the heart of the discussion. But this needs an integrated and an inclusive approach. In the Sustainable Development Goals, it is said that we should not leave anyone behind. All different actors or different stakeholders should be part of the process. And the basis of this is at least to bring the process at the common understanding, to have everyone on board and value what people are doing on the ground in terms of knowledge. For example, the local know-how, the traditional knowledge. All these things need to be, bring on board. The discussion of ambitious climate objectives, I think, for low carbon and resilience, that are part of the more general perspective of development trajectory that aim at responding in the short term economic, social, and environmental emergency should be met also in the long term. So I consider some pillars. The pillar I consider, the one is the structural and systemic transformation via intersectoral dialogue. If you look at the process of climate change, how it's happened, only few ministries are involved in the process. We can say, for example, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Finance, because we are discussing finance, the Ministry of Energy, because we start discussing on just energy transition partnership, the JETP that you hear. There are the other sector, I mean, the ministries are not enough involved. And I think this should be at least based in the development of quality infrastructure, the promotion of inclusive and sustainable industrialization, the strengthening the base of higher productivities, for example, in terms of accessing to fertile land, but also improving the access of energy. For that, I think also we will need to really have a comprehensive long-term strategy for broader and reliable access to quality energy at affordable cost, which consider, as I have said, just energy transition. For some countries, I will take the case of Senegal. We are a country producing hydrocarbon. I think that the benefit of this may or should contribute in promoting access to solar energy, particularly in the rural area. I think to decompartmentalize the sectors in terms of direction of development that should be more holistic, we need to work on some nexus like energy, water, agriculture. The access to clean energy for industrial development for us is key in terms of greening of industry. Increase the development of energy efficiency culture through a structuring program, which is not the case in many countries and even in many communities. Securing the domestic fuel supply, as I have said, we always use in a higher percentage the biomass, the wood fuel, and I think this needs to be at least improved by facilitating access to LPG or biogas. I think there are many other solutions that we can adopt in our country. Raja has talked about the localization of public policies and the scale up of through the involvement of the different actors at the grassroots level. What we are trying to do here in ENDA is at least helping the localities to be part of the process of climate change, to understand that there is an opportunity for them to access to finance. But before that, there is a need at least to integrate the issue of climate change and even energy in their plan. So many of them start reformulating or elaborating plans that are considering energy and climate change. And as I have said, we have here in Senegal an example, the municipalities that we call friendship, which are focusing on management of waste. We know that many coastal communities they are using the sea as for their waste, and this is affecting the marine ecosystem. And what we are doing with them is trying to recycle this waste, which is becoming more and more understood as an opportunity to enhance their incomes, and also in another way to have with the government policies that are considering not only one locality but more than two localities to avoid having maladaptation when we are building marine infrastructure. So talking about the development that should be more integrated or inclusive, after that the energy issues and the localization, I think that there is a transformation in terms of land use system. Give opportunities at least to communities to value their know-how in terms of agroecology. I think this kind of approach contribute also to maintain in a sustainable way the use of the arable land, and then this should be based, I think, on land security, giving possibilities for farmers to own their land, giving a possibility for pastoralists to access to land for their pasture, sustainable land management, I mean where the land are salinized to see how to reclaim this land, enhance the knowledge of organic farming, the water availability. In our region, we say that sometimes there is no water, but there is water. The problem is not that. The problem is how to access to the water, particularly the groundwater. And then if we want to access to the groundwater, definitely we'll need to have this technology that will allow us to value the renewable energy. So after the transformation related to the land system, so I could develop more on this because we have the training of producer and breeders, the rationalization or the organization of these communities in cooperative to really promote the social and local entrepreneurship, as I have said, based on the value chain. So there is the transformation of urban and infrastructure system. You know, in our many countries, so the urban area is growing, reaching the community, the localities, and I think that there is a lot to do, not only to improve the urban mobility, but at least to promote green space or urban agriculture. And the last one is related to the transformation of industrial system. So we have many expectations.
Well, if I may interrupt for a moment, I'm a little bit worried about time. Do you think you could finish in about a minute?
I'm ending. I'm ending. Ending by just saying that we must take a more active role to avoid looking behind ourselves and blaming an international governance system, which sometimes is defective in truly addressing the issues of climate change through adequate finance, when the real power for change lies within our hands. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. That was a very kind of grounded in reality presentation, so it was very, very much appreciated. Our fourth speaker is Catherine Bakos, who is going to speak on towards COP28, leveraging resources to build climate resilient societies. So over to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much. And Chet, I know that I saw that you had your hand up. Did you want to say something? I hope we can keep everyone on. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So did you want to say anything?
No, I'm sorry, Catherine. Just go ahead.
No problem. So I do recognize that we did say the meeting was going to be till 1:30. So for all the participants, if you can stay on for a few extra minutes, that would be wonderful. Of course, I will be respectful of your time. So my name is Catherine Bakos. Can we all see the presentation?
Yes, Catherine,
Yes.
this is Mike. If I could just interrupt, I think the time was extended until 2 o'clock. So we
wonderful. So I didn't even see that. So that's wonderful to hear.
Don't feel rushed.
Okay, that's wonderful. But of course, I want to leave some time for questions. So it's a pleasure to be with you all. Just to reiterate, my name is Catherine Bakos, and I'm Managing Director of Finance and Resilience at the INTAC Center on Climate Adaptation. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the INTAC Center, we are an applied research center of the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, that helps homeowners, communities, businesses, and governments reduce risks associated with climate change and extreme weather events. Now, that's particularly in relation to flooding, wildfire, and extreme heat, as you can see from the photos here. So I was really asked to speak today from a more global perspective, and specifically honing in on what Canada itself is doing, and potentially how those resources can be extrapolated and used globally to build climate resilient societies. So I'm here to focus, my presentation is going to delve into the importance of adaptation, the associated cost of extreme weather, which some of my panelists have already described. So I won't spend too much time there, just more to show a visual. And then the available resources for building more resilient societies. So to reiterate, the focus of my presentation is going to be Canadian based. So it's going to focus on climate resilient resources here in Canada, but I will strive to contextualize that information within the broader global and African perspective. So I'm going to try to keep it to just over 15 minutes. So we have plenty of time for any questions that might come in. Please feel free to put any questions for all of the panelists in the chat if you can. So just flipping in, so this has been covered, and I know everyone on this call is very familiar, at least with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But I just wanted to offer these two reports here. So from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Environment and Climate Change Canada, the first two reports on the left, we know from the scientific community climate change is real. It has happened, it is happening, and it will continue to happen. What I find very fascinating from these two reports in particular, specifically the one from Environment and Climate Change Canada, is it highlights that a certain degree of climate change is already priced into the system, and therefore it is in fact irreversible, and it uses that word, the irreversibility of climate change. So we can slow down the rate of change, but we cannot reverse it, at least not with the technology that we currently have. And of course, everyone on this call understands that this is occurring because of the burning of fossil fuels. Now, so much emphasis, from my opinion, is focused on transitioning to a greener economy, which is incredibly important, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. But we know as growing climate change impacts are experienced across the globe, the message is that greenhouse gas emissions must fall, and they must. Yet we know, according to the United Nations Environment Program, their emissions gap report of 2022, the closing window, which is the report on the right, finds that international commitments to the Paris Agreement, they're falling short, and only an urgent system-wide transformation is going to avoid climate disaster. And so strategies to mitigate against greenhouse gas emissions, these are imperative to avoid the worst impacts of climate change in the future, but that will not stop or reverse the damage that's already been done. So those efforts must continue, but we also have to acknowledge that the severe impacts of climate change, they're already present today, and they're going to continue to be present into the future. And so adaptation, building resilience within our communities and across our societies globally needs to be a much more important part of the climate change discussion, specifically at COP28 and beyond. And so how many resources currently are actually being directed to adaptation right now? Well, we know, according to the United Nations Environment Program, their adaptation gap report of 2023, which was released just this past month, finds that progress on climate adaptation is slowing on all three areas that were assessed. So when we look at climate adaptation, finance, planning, and implementation, all of that progress is slowing. Now, in regards to finance, the adaptation needs for developing countries is growing, and yet public finance flows, as my colleagues had mentioned earlier, those have declined by approximately 15%, despite pledges that have already been made at COP26 in Glasgow to actually double adaptation finance support. And I agree with Anya that there's a lot of complications associated with the adaptation finance support. But at the end of the day, it's still falling short. Now, the current adaptation finance gap is to be estimated between 194 to 366 billion US dollars per year globally that we're missing out on in regards to adaptation. So we can directly see how commitments from previous COPs have fallen short, and where COP28 needs to focus on adaptation more broadly. Of course, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions is incredibly important, but there needs to be greater focus on adaptation going forward. Now, in addition to financing, we're also seeing adaptation planning and implementation, they're plateauing as well. Now, despite obviously the increased need for adaptation actions. And yet we know investing in adaptation now will minimize climate costs in the future. So just as an example, here in Canada, for every dollar of adaptation that we put into place, that saves individuals, communities, businesses, and governments on average $3 to $8 in cost avoidance over a 10-year period. And in my opinion, this is a conservative estimate. This also does not include the benefits of natural infrastructure, whether that's water flow stabilization, flood attenuation, heat stress attenuation, the mental health benefits, the biodiversity benefits. Those costs are not even incorporated into this. So again, for every dollar of adaptation saves you $3 to $8 over the long-term period. So again, in my opinion, a conservative estimate. But let's just go back a second. What are the costs of adaptation? So let's just make sure. Yes, perfect. So if this image here, and as one of my fellow panelists had already explained, some of the global costs of climate change. So this image here is just kind of a visual of all those costs that she was speaking about. So this image displays the annual insured losses globally. So as you can see, there's a discernible upward trend, and losses have mostly been driven by extreme weather events. So if you focus on those green bars, weather-related insured losses such as deep winter freezes, floods, severe thunderstorms, heat waves, and hurricanes are some of the major causes of global losses, which are estimated at approximately $125 billion in 2022 alone. So just 1 year was $125 billion Now, in addition, there was a recent study that indicated 55% of the most climate vulnerable economies have already experienced loss and damage of more than $500 billion in the last 2 decades. These costs are going to continue to rise steeply in the coming decades, particularly in the absence of forceful adaptation. So it's important to understand where these losses are coming from, but more specifically, where they're coming from on a country-to-country basis, so that you can identify what country-specific measures need to be put into place to reduce that risk. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to hone in on Canada here as an example, because I'm more familiar with our market here. So similar to the graph on the last slide, this image here displays annual catastrophic insurable losses for Canada. So a CAT loss is any event, a flood, wildfire, hailstorm, windstorm, that triggers $25 million or more of insured losses. So between 1983 to 2008, losses range from approximately $250 to $450 million per year. From 2009 onward, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's within the gray box region that now I'm focusing on, losses now average approximately $2 billion a year. So as you can see from 2009 onward, again, which is within the gray box region, there is this discernible upward trend in losses, which is similar to the global insured losses from the previous slide. So whether we're looking at losses globally or country specific, there is a trend of increasing losses due to extreme weather. So it's important to note that these are insurable losses. Multiply this graph by 3 to 4 times, and what you get is uninsured losses that individuals, businesses, and governments are paying out of pocket for. Now, for governments specifically, that's money coming out of budgets for hospitals, schools, infrastructure development. So we have to understand, and I know everyone on this call very much understands, the socioeconomic impacts that are happening because of climate change. But now let's begin to actually isolate for extreme weather events. So if we focus here in Canada, flooding, if we isolate for flood, wildfire, wind, hail, flooding is actually greater than 60% of all losses, with wildfire a close second. So losses due to flooding are mostly coming from flooding, manifesting itself as flooded basements. Now, remember, we're talking about insured losses here, and specifically here in Canada. Uninsured losses would be impacts to infrastructure, such as buildings, roads, and bridges. So what do we do about those impacts? Well, we need guidance and tools to help individuals, communities, businesses, and governments reduce the key climate risks in Canada. Flooding and wildfire are your costliest from a financial perspective here in Canada. And as we saw on the last slide, and extreme heat is actually the costliest in regards to loss of life. So just to give you a few examples, in the Canadian province of Quebec in 2018, they experienced an extreme heat event where 86 people passed away. In another province in Canada, British Columbia, 619 people passed away because of an extreme heat event in 2021, which was called the heat dome. And just to give a little bit of perspective and scale, last year in Europe, over 60,000 people died because of extreme heat. So we can see the impacts from financial and social that these impacts are having. And so our team at the Intact Center, what we do is we work with organizations, and I'll just give a few examples here. So the Standards Council of Canada, the Canadian Standards Association, and generally speaking, for any of the reports you see here, we bring together 60 to 80 subject matter experts from across the country with relevant expertise to develop practical, meaningful, and cost-effective ways to adapt to the physical risks of climate change. So on this slide, I've provided guidelines to reduce the risk of flooding at the level of the home and community, new and existing community design. So how should homes and communities be built and retrofitted to reduce the risk of flooding, as well as commercial real estate, coastal communities, and the importance of retaining and restoring natural infrastructure. So those benefits that come with wetlands, grasslands, and forested areas to attenuate the effects of flooding. Now, in regards to wildfire, the Intact Center has developed wildfire protection measures at the level of the home and community. And we've also investigated the impact extreme heat has on infrastructure and services, the economy, community, health, and natural systems. Now, the direction outlined in these reports, it can be used by individuals and community leaders to understand how risk can be mitigated at the community level, while also ensuring information is distributed to individuals so they can reduce risk at their own property levels. So just as an example, in the report at the top left-hand corner of your screen for flood and home, across Canada, we know we should be distributing home flood protection information to reduce basement flooding, which is the costliest insured loss here in Canada. Now, let me offer you a better visual of that. So at the Intact Center, what we did was we took that 100-page report and we actually distilled that information down, because who wants to read a 100-page report? Of course, you're more than welcome to if you'd like. But the report is actually just there to show that the research has been done. And then the key findings of the report assisted in the creation of this, which is the 3 steps to cost-effective home flood protection infographic, which drills down around characteristics around and inside a home that, when major precipitation events occur, could impact the probability of whether a home is flooded or not. So we took that report, we distilled it down, because again, who's going to read a 100-page report? Here's a 1-page pamphlet that we can distribute in property tax mailout notices, advertisements, newspapers. And so we can actually directly get this into people's hands, mortgage mailouts, insurance mailouts. So we can get this information into people's hands. Now, this information might not be directly applicable to you. I know homes globally, some don't have basements. So I understand this might not be applicable to you. But really what it's here for is to illustrate how here in Canada, we identified what the risks are to the Canadian system, and then how we develop practical, meaningful, and cost-effective tools to distribute to individuals so they can reduce risk at their own property level, as an example. Now, globally and specifically throughout African countries, this is a great opportunity. Of course, we have to talk about financing and then planning and implementation. But that planning, to me, is probably the most important, and I'll talk about this a little bit later. But you could have the money in hand, but we need to understand where the risks are in the system, where the greatest costs are financially and socially. And then we also have to understand what measures we're putting into place, and we need to ensure that those measures are not maladaptive, so that these measures being put in place actually aren't more harmful than they are helpful. So we need to be able to identify these risks, and then of course we need resources to be able to put those measures into place. Now, if we move from the insurable perspective when we're talking about flooded basements, now to the uninsurable perspective where infrastructure is being impacted. So now, for buildings specifically, flood resilience guidance for commercial real estate, that's already been developed for Canada, including 20 practical actions to help governments and businesses get their property portfolios climate ready. And so what we did was we performed this report. So we did the research in this report ahead of the storm. And so our team took the research from this report and we distilled that information down once again into this 1-page infographic to highlight the key areas of focus for risk reduction. So that would be including when we're looking at big infrastructure such as commercial real estate. What should we be doing in regards to plans and procedures, equipment and supplies, and major retrofits, as well as what to do before, during, and after a major flood event. So this information, it was supported by subject matter experts and industry associations here in Canada. And so we know what the key measures are that any owner or operator of a building within Canada should be taking to reduce risks. But I say here in Canada, but actually this work has been so applicable that companies in the United States, certain states in the United States, they're using this information, as well as countries throughout Europe are using this information. And so there's applicability with the research that we've completed. And so when we're looking at, well, what do we actually have to do in the system? You might not have to start from scratch. We should understand what resources are available globally, and then we should be translating those resources into our own country-specific resources. Now, for construction and development, businesses and individuals located in the wildland-urban interface, so this is where human development meets wildland vegetation, there's a wealth of wildfire resilience information through an organization called Fire Smart Canada. And we've been very lucky to work with Fire Smart Canada to develop guidance and basic training on property level wildfire resilience and landscaping. And so similar to the 3 steps to home flood protection, we developed these 3 steps to wildfire protection at the level of the home and community. So how should homes and communities be built and retrofitted to reduce risk? We've identified this risk, and now we actually have answers for what measures need to be put into place as quickly as possible to reduce that risk. And there's things that individuals can do around their home for limited costs, so from zero to limited cost, and obviously larger costs associated with bigger changes around their own properties or at the community level. Now, if we turn to extreme heat, which is a major concern here in Canada, but also globally, so specifically any countries that have urban areas, they potentially could experience what's called the urban heat island effect. So this is where urban areas, so that paved over land, so all natural infrastructure has been ripped up, cement goes in, so it's that dark surfaces. It absorbs heat from the sun, and it actually causes 10 to 15 degree higher temperatures than surrounding non-urban areas. And so specific actions have been documented in this national guidance document, Irreversible Extreme Heat: Protecting Canadians and Communities from a Lethal Future. So our team investigated the impact extreme heat has on infrastructure and services, natural systems, the economy, and community health. So the report sets out actions that individuals, building owners, managers, and communities can take to reduce associated risks associated with extreme heat. So things like non-structural, so individual behavioral solutions. How are we checking in on our neighbors, specifically the most vulnerable? Natural infrastructure solutions, retaining and restoring natural infrastructure solutions or rebuilding natural infrastructure where appropriate, and then installing green roofs on some of our larger buildings. And then built infrastructure solution, passive and active cooling buildings, and power backup generation. Now, similar to all the other Intact Center resources, we've distilled that information down into one-page infographics for individuals at the level of the home and apartment and condo to reduce extreme heat risk. Now, from the United Nations Environment Adaptation Gap Report that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, we know that 5 out of 6 countries now have at least one national adaptation planning instrument to reduce risk. So here in Canada, we have Canada's National Adaptation Strategy, which was released this year and sets long-term transformational goals, as well as medium and short-term objectives to ensure that we have direction for climate resilience in the country. Now, in my opinion, it's really those short-term and medium-term objectives that are really the most impressive to me. So the Canadian government is not waiting to be held accountable in 2040 or 2050. They recognize action must be taken now. And to do that, we must be able to hold our governments responsible for action or inaction. So just as a few examples, as you can see on your screen, part of the National Adaptation Strategy are these 2 examples. So by 2025, 50% of Canadians should be aware of extreme weather risks facing their households, and 60% have taken action to reduce those risks. So by 2025, Canadians will be able to determine if their government has met this goal or not. So the resources that I've provided throughout this presentation, they're directly applicable to assist the Canadian government at all levels to provide individuals with information to get risk out of the system. So it's not so much about identifying the risk is incredibly important, but we need to reduce that risk as well. So from Canada's perspective, we should be promoting these resources at COP28 and future COPs to highlight the leadership Canada has already taken on the adaptation file and how other countries globally can adopt these resources and translate them into their own country-specific resources. So thinking about setting up your own adaptation plans, we have to remember that goals in 2040 and 2050, in my opinion, they're there to delay action. And so we need those short and medium term objectives to be held accountable for. So measures can be put into place to reduce risk now. But really, what should we be doing globally, and specifically in African countries? Well, in conclusion, as we head towards COP28 must deliver new momentum on adaptation. So as Anya had mentioned, the Loss and Damage Fund and financing, I believe there's a lot of complications that are associated with that, especially ongoing discussions about the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. But at the end of the day, I do believe that these are important steps in the right direction. We need policymakers and multilateral banks, investors in the private sector must make COP28 the moment that the world commits to fully insulating developing countries and specifically disadvantaged groups. So from women and Indigenous people from climate impacts. Now, in addition to financing, though, we need to focus on what we do once we actually have that money in hand. So financing is incredibly important, but where will that money go once we have it in hand? So that planning and implementation are so incredibly important too, but it's important to figure that out before we get that money in hand. Because once we have that money in hand, we need to make sure it doesn't go to waste, or as I had mentioned earlier, that we're not putting that towards measures that are actually maladaptive. So again, action that's harmful and not helpful. Now, from my own personal experience and work experience in countries like Kenya, Malawi, Zambia, and Morocco, just as my colleagues have talked about, all of these amazing things that are happening throughout Africa, I've seen these amazing developments happen on the ground as well. Now, I know Anya is in Nairobi, Kenya right now, so I just want to talk about some of my experience there. When I was there in 2016, I was really fascinated to see the widespread infrastructure from roads and bridges being developed. And so I can only imagine how much more has been done since then. But when I think about the increasing pressure from extreme weather, are adaptation measures being incorporated into these developments? And my assumption, it's not even being done here in Canada. And so my assumption is it is not. And again, I can be completely wrong. But we have to keep in mind that the costs for building right in the first place are as cost effective as building without adaptation measures. It's the same cost. Adaptation measures only become increasingly expensive if infrastructure needs to be retrofitted. Therefore, we need to be building right in the first place. But to build right, though, we need to understand where risk is in the system. And we need to work with subject matter experts, engineers, developers, contractors, academics, to identify what practical, meaningful, and cost-effective measures can be put into place to reduce that risk. So again,
I wonder if I could interrupt you for a moment. We've just got about 10 minutes left.
I was just finishing up my last sentence. So if you just let me finish up, and I'll be finishing up right away. So just please use Canada as an example for how we've identified risk. Looking from those insurable and uninsurable claims, we can actually pinpoint exactly where loss is happening, looking at the financial and social costs that are happening because of climate change, and then working to understand what measures actually need to be put into place. And of course, there's a big conversation around financing around that, but we need to know what to do. So once we have money in hand, we can implement the appropriate measures. So I'll end it right there. Mike, I'll hand it back over to you, but thank you also very much for your time, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was most informative and a very, very appropriate final presentation. We have less than 10 minutes. It would be nice to have a little bit of interaction among the panelists on what you've heard. So I would like to encourage any panelist that wants to react to one of your colleagues' presentations to do so. Specifically, I do have a question for all of you, but in particular, perhaps starting with Anya. Anya, you talked about African agency, and you mentioned the inaugural African Union summit in Nairobi recently. Are there other things that African countries can do individually and together that would increase Africa's influence at the COP28 table?
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, I think the most important thing is to find a common position. You see, I mean, Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa is made up of so many countries, yeah, 56, 55, a large block of countries. And, you know, if they all come in with the same position, it's impossible to find a resolution that is not in the interest of Africa. And I think, you know, it's obviously all the countries are very different. Also behind the scenes, I'm sure, you know, there were some discussions on the Nairobi Declaration, but at the end of the day, I think the negotiators group really understood that in the moment in which Africa presents itself as a unified continent, they have a very strong leverage in the negotiations. So this is the first point, saying, you know, we are speaking here, and without the continent of Africa, you can't really make policies anymore. And secondly, as I said, I think it's really important in this critical world situation that we are facing. I would even say, honestly, people are getting a bit tired to always hear, you know, we need more money, we need more money. It's all about the money. But, you know, changing the narrative and saying, look, we have a very attractive offer here. You know, we have the minerals that you need. We have the metals that you need. We have huge ecosystems that, you know, if we would kill the rainforest in DRC, I mean, that would be a catastrophe, right? So you want this? How much are you ready to pay for it? How can we make, you know, the best out of it for both sides? But really kind of sharing this, you know, changing this narrative where Africa always is perceived, or, you know, let me say that even if it might come out a bit, you know, from a European working in Africa, kind of see themselves as a victim. There's so much that Africa has to offer. And I think if you want to have an equal seat at the negotiation tables, you need to you know, you need to actively sell what you can bring into. And then people will also start to listen and really recognize, you know, the incredibly economic growth that, you know, is still predicted for African countries in the years to come, while other countries are not in that situation anymore, is a really enormous opportunity also from an economic point of view for industries to invest in Africa. And we will have some kind of, you know, carbon pricing, be it CBAM, be it another mechanism. But there's really an opportunity to create completely green industry here that are low carbon emission, if not completely out, you know, without emissions. And then you will have a very competitive advantage. It's probably not tomorrow, but 5-10 years along the lane. You have a competitive advantage to sell your product low carbon with low carbon emissions made in Africa. And I think these kinds, you know, these arguments need to be more prominently placed in the discussion.
Thank you so much. Perhaps a question for Dr. Sheffield. Raja, you talked about the work that Katsim Maroc is doing to build capacity across Africa. You talked about 35 different countries being involved in your work. Are there things that other individual countries, including, say, Canada, could do to assist in building capacity in African nations on both the adaptation to climate change, the just transition that Emmanuel was talking about, but also in building their general influence in international discussions? What could countries like Canada do to help?
Yeah, thank you very much. Oui, en fait, au Centre 4C Maroc, nous avons déjà une excellente coopération avec le Canada. Nous avons eu une première expérience de collaboration avec Uranos Canada, qui se trouve à Montréal. Donc, c'était pour faire une sorte d'échange d'expérience entre Uranos Canada et le 4C Maroc, parce que nous sommes un petit peu semblables. Donc, nous avons développé un projet très intéressant où on a organisé une douzaine de webinaires pendant le Covid. C'était vraiment très intéressant, où on mettait dans les webinaires des experts canadiens et des experts marocains, donc, et africains. Ça, c'était une expérience très réussie. Et actuellement, nous sommes en train de créer, avec Uranos Canada et avec d'autres centres en Afrique, un réseau de centres d'expertise en changement climatique. Nous avons créé l'idée de mettre en place ce réseau de centres d'expertise à Montréal il y a 4 semaines, et nous allons avoir une réunion à la COP28 donc de ces centres. Il y a le 4C Maroc, Uranos Canada, un centre au Sénégal et d'autres centres au Bangladesh, etc. Aussi, nous avons eu un deuxième projet très intéressant avec le Canada. Il vient de se terminer avec Affaires mondiales Canada. Et donc, ce projet financé par le Canada nous a permis de faire 3 activités très importantes. D'une part, nous avons démarré la cartographie des risques climatiques au Maroc. C'est une première expérience que nous menons avec des experts canadiens et internationaux. C'est vraiment une excellente expérience qui était vraiment très attendue au Maroc. La deuxième activité que nous avons menée avec le Canada, c'est l'empowerment des jeunes dans les négociations climat. Nous avons formé 200 jeunes leaders, filles et garçons africains d'une quarantaine de pays à la veille de la COP 27 sur les négociations climat. Et donc, nous menons également d'autres activités avec le Canada. On espère justement, on a mené également avec le Canada une étude sur le genre et le changement climatique dans les politiques climat au niveau national, en Afrique, mais également dans les activités de renforcement des compétences du 4C Maroc. Donc, nous avons une excellente expérience de coopération avec le Canada et on espère que nous pouvons, en tout cas, nous sommes très ouverts donc pour une collaboration future avec des organismes canadiens et avec la coopération canadienne. Nous restons très ouverts, bien entendu, pour développer d'autres activités parce que le Canada, sur le plan scientifique, en termes d'évaluation de vulnérabilité, adaptation, ils sont très avancés. Et on aimerait avoir plus de transfert de savoir-faire entre le Canada et l'Afrique, justement, pour tout ce qui est évaluation de la vulnérabilité et des options d'adaptation.
Oui. Merci beaucoup, Raja. And I would like to thank all the panelists for your participation today. This was an amazingly informative and I believe productive session. And thank you all very much. Sheikh, I will pass things back to you. Do we have Sheikh?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you to the panelists. We are coming now to the end of our session, a very interesting session, and an excellent moderation, Mike. And I'm very grateful that we had you today to address such complicated issues of climate change on the eve of COP28. On behalf of the Africa Study Group of the Canadian International Council, I would like to thank our panelists for their excellent presentation. Dr. Shafil was talking to us from Morocco, from Rabat. Dr. Beretta, Anya was talking to us from Nairobi. It's now almost midnight there. Emmanuel Sek was talking to us from Dakar. It's almost 8 o'clock. And Catherine from Waterloo. I am grateful for your cooperation and for accepting to stay so long in order to bring such fundamental information to our audience. I will just like to thank you for your great cooperation in preparing this roundtable. I have most appreciated our pre-discussion, not least in the choice of your topics, which has enabled us to avoid duplicities and create a certain profound intellectual complementarity in today's discussions. Chers panélistes, je vous remercie éperdument au nom du Conseil international du Canada. I would like to thank our colleagues, Mafoya, Communication Director of Africa Study Group, as well as our dear colleagues, Olivia Lassaline, Mariana Zafka, Anel Akobeto, Cameron and Joshua Adams, at the CIC National Capital Branch for all the efforts that went into organizing this session. We are grateful. Merci, Professor Otiono and the Institute for African Studies for this great partnership. The Africa Study Group is directly affiliated with the Canadian International Council, and we encourage our members to join the Canadian International Council, especially the National Capital Branch. This invitation is extended to our members and our audience, both in Canada and outside of Canada, and also to our panelists today. The next Africa Study Group webinars will be soon announced on our website. However, I'm honored to disclose that this will be on the launch of a book written by one of our members on the role and history of African women for democracy in Africa. It is always a source of pride for us to realize that one of our members has written a book. This is all the more important as our member believe that the narrative around Africa, and that's also the level for the COP28, the narrative around Africa must change to highlight opportunities for Canada. And as many people say, especially Muzewe, our brother and friend from the Africa Study Group, as Africa technology and innovation ecosystems mature, its countries and companies will be looking for suitable partners. These will be all for today. I wish you good health, and I promise we will keep this recording at your disposal. I wish you good health, and depending on where you are, a good day, good afternoon, and good night. Merci et à la prochaine.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.